The sun dawns on January 1st, 700, the intervening centuries having reshaped the world, and the crashing waves of history's tide washing over Scythia, which only now stood at the precipice of awakening from its slumber, the Dyrg Vaarza. This kept them isolated and in the dark for nearly 900 years, its subfactions and internal divisions functioning as essentially different realms all their own, responding as one only to threats of outside invasion. By this point, the Aspah Daagen had risen to prominence as a scholarly and religious order, residing in what has since become a great temple complex built around the grave of Rathnakuda, called the Rathnakudan. From the stalwart walls of the Rathnakudan, they were the mediators of conflict, the dispensers of legitimacy, and the keepers of history. 50 years prior, they had sent scouts and explorers to the very edges of the known world, mapping it and its peoples in meticulous, obsessive detail. The result of this was the compiling of the first true atlas, called the Dzaam Zadyn, or the Total Map. Penned in the High Scythian tongue, it was fully illustrated with a huge 4-foot by 4-foot map of the known world, kept in an inner pocket behind the front cover, with the rest of the book containing lore, legends, histories, and even personal profiles from royal interviews far afield. Not all the Aspah priests survived the journey, but indeed their sacrifice was not in vain. Some men spent their entire lives filling these pages, leaving as young men and returning as old men to hand in these pages to the sacred priesthood of the Rathnakudan. The Dzaam Zadyn opens with a primer on events which have impacted the whole world first, namely the new religions which have foisted their dominion upon the world. First, around 33 AD, in the Egyptian province of Judea, the authorities crucified a rowdy Jewish carpenter who claimed to be the Son of God. The legacy of this miracle worker did not end here, however, as when his followers went to see his body, he had vanished, and they would go on to carry his message to the very ends of the earth, and even to the very point of death, and then beyond it. In the intervening centuries, what was once an obscure cult became a persecuted religion, specifically in the 300s under Pharaoh Hyrax Lagid, who had a penchant for feeding Christians, as they came to be called, to Nile crocodiles, and exiled those who hid or helped them, doomed to wander in the desert. In time, however, Egypt would come to enact an edict of tolerance regarding the Christians, as by the 500s they had grown far too numerous, but that didn't mean they were looked upon kindly by the royal pharaohs. Even if the religion never gained an official status in that country, the missionaries driven abroad from the banks of the Nile certainly won great favor in foreign lands, namely in Santonia and Rhodes. Indeed, legend says that Saint Paul himself proselytized in Rhodes, being received by the royal family themselves, but was beheaded on his return journey by visiting Egyptian magistrates who were sent there to advise the king of Rhodes for the crime of denying the divinity of the Greek pharaohs. Rhodes would gradually Christianize from the throne room down until there would be a major war in the mid-500s, led by Basileus Kyros Demeratid of Rhodes, to simultaneously break away from the overlordship of the Greek pharaohs and conquer the Holy Land from their pagan rule. Despite the odds, they achieved a great victory, and in so doing, established themselves as the first Christian kingdom in the world, and also set themselves in eternal enmity against ancient Egypt. The Kingdom of Rhodes became the nexus of Christian thought and power, and a great church was built in Jerusalem upon the site of Christ's crucifixion, called the Basilica of the Holy Cross. It was from here that the church would have its strong footing, and the ecumenical councils would be convened to handle the theological discourse and matters of official doctrine. The Bishop of Rhodes would lead them as the first among equals, the present Bishop of Rhodes being Aristarchus III. Just as the dust began to settle, an Arab from the depths of the shifting sands started his own cult in the 600s that would spill out into the wider region, fed on conquest and a mandate of holy war. The Rashidun Caliphate, as it was called, was led by Muhammad himself, as he conquered Syria from Rhodes, Mesopotamia from the Seleucid Empire, and even began to win battle after battle against Armenia, and colonized the eastern coast of Africa. The whole time, they were slaughtering pagans, Christians, and Jews alike, and taking control of cities of untold antiquity. It seemed like they would wash over the world itself. That was, of course, until Muhammad died, poisoned by a slave in his harem, and his followers couldn't agree on who should lead, fracturing the Rashidun Caliphate and even Islam itself. The Famudi Caliphate believed that his uncle, Abu Salib, should rule as the competent leader, while those of the Gerha Caliphate believed that his son Qasim should rule. As it stood, Islam was headed and fractured, and yet more theological offshoots beyond the Sunni-Shia split were arising every day. With the new religions covered, the Dzaam Zadyn returns to the present day, beginning, of course, with royal Scythia, the honored homeland and base of the Aspah Daagen. By 700, the Agrid faction, under the auspices of Sarvan Salamander XVII, was on the very cusp of victory. The only rivals left for him to defeat were the Upali under Sarvan Mukulanti Upal, and the Rizvadites under the Sarvan Sitre VI Rizvadan. In truth, these men were cornered, and unless they came to the table to surrender, the Dyrg Vaarza would end with their death. Indeed, the Agrids had been on the winning side for nearly 2 centuries now, and it was clear to all observers that it was simply a matter of time. The idea of Saklamander's sacred blood and the demigod status of his particular lineage inspired many to action, and Salamander XVII carried on this noble tradition as a good and wise ruler who administered the realm with particular grace and poise. He was a known builder and reformer, constructing great cities, including the new capital, Taganrog, on the banks of the Azov Sea. In terms of reforms, this was more a credit to his family line. As the Agrid realm grew, they came across people with cultures that had drifted significantly, and families that ruled them which had no other choice but to play the hand they'd been dealt. In Upali lands, they had a tradition of eating raw mincemeat and celebrated the winter solstice with a great bonfire. In the realm of the Mennonites, they had a coming-of-age test administered to children beneath the watchful eyes of Zeus, including tests of strength, history, and religious knowledge. Under the Rizvadites, people held a religious tradition of ritual bathing before engaging in commerce or recording inventory. As such, instead of slaughtering all their conquered enemies wholesale, they simply executed their pretender cousins, then allowed cadet branches to rule over these now culturally distinct regions as mere provinces within a wider kingdom. The system that took shape was similar to the ancient one, with a central ruling clan under the Agarids, and several lesser clans in the form of the Rizvadites, Mennonites, and so on. The system saw a rural aristocracy ruling over vast tracts of steppe land from their grand country estates, and empowering governors to rule over the urban centers, in some cases choosing local men, and in other cases picking members from their own clan. So, as the last of the rival elements stared down their doom, Sarvan Salamander might as well already be a king over Scythia. Moving west, the Gallic region was absolutely dominated by the Kingdom of Santonia, hemmed in by regional rivals like Treveria and Vasconia. Santonia, under High King Segovax Corrosion IV, was a zealous adopter of Christianity, the realm first coming to the faith in 561 under Segovax I, after a missionary who would come to be known as Saint Domneu was tied to a tree in a sacred druid's grove for spreading the gospel, and when they pierced his heart, it was said his blood sank into the soil and killed the whole forest, from which a field of wild berries grew. Segovax, who ate of the sacred berry grove, then led a bloody campaign of conversion across the realm, burning idols and putting druids to the sword. Now a close and natural ally of Rhodes, Santonia became a beneficiary of their technology and administrative techniques, becoming one of the most advanced and centralized countries in Europe, with King Segovax able to administer his realm with such efficiency and singularity of purpose that made his enemies totally unable to prevent the growth of his borders. Indeed, the system that would come to define the age, of powerful lords pledging men to their king, was absent in Santonia, and indeed wouldn't develop in the first place, with the king himself administering a standing army and even a fledgling navy, his lords seen as renting their land and their position from the throne in the form of taxes and their own levies to bolster the standing army, called the Crown Army. The Gauls of Santonia lived prosperous lives on the ground, with large cities across the kingdom hemmed by countless quaint villages protected by the regional generals of the Crown Army. The aristocracy in this way was restrained and allowed the people to prosper. Many of them had time to learn how to read and write in their village churches and had established a very efficient system of seasonal harvesting. Meanwhile, Santonia's ancient enemy to the northeast, Treveria, under King Eponymapush Adiatrix, was different in every way. Treveria was thoroughly pagan and was the refuge destination of choice for the countless druids and pagan faithful that fled the Great Conversion. While it is true that they were outnumbered and outmatched by Santonia, they were still able to hold their own. They erected a complex system of forts and palisades along their border with them, each one manned by a tribal war chief and a band of his most loyal men. Treverian society was simultaneously libertine and draconian, a contradiction which showed in nearly every aspect of life. The Treverian elite was made up of the great tribal clans and also the Sacred Grove, which was their equivalent of a druidic church. The king was selected from among the clans on a case-by-case basis, only rarely following bloodline, while the confirmation of the king by the Sacred Grove was an absolute necessity. They had only one great city, that being their capital Breda on the banks of the Rhine. The rest of the country was a loosely connected system of villages administered directly by the great clans, which were highly independent and served as an almost entirely unregulated aristocracy. They were even able to go on raids abroad without approval from their anemic crown. On the ground, Treverian commoners were largely unbothered by cultural or religious law, only hassled for their high taxes, and sometimes to surrender sons to the levies which made up the Treverian army. They observed a variety of bizarre traditions and holidays, and despite their inefficient agricultural capacity, they were observed to be constantly feasting over one thing or another. Of course, two laws reigned supreme in Treveria over all others. First, writing, and therefore literacy in general, was the exclusive domain of the Druids, who viewed writing as having a sacred, magical significance, leading to nearly the entire country, highest aristocracy included, being totally illiterate. Second, Christianity was completely illegal, punishable by burning at the stake. Treveria was, by comparison, quite primitive, but they were so tenacious and stubborn that they yet survived in a world that felt as though it was leaving them behind. Iberia was one of the battlegrounds of the 8th century, with Vasconia pulling out ahead as one of the most powerful contenders for the east and north, while domineering Emporia threatened to swallow up the whole peninsula from the south, leaving the three allies of Neria, Topolia, and Cilicia to somehow resist these forces of empire. Beginning with Vasconia, under Queen Ermesinda La Rioja, this Basque realm was a late adopter of Christianity, indeed only having officially converted around 689. This conversion was somewhat artificial, and pursued largely in the face of Santonian aggression from the north. This resulted in an odd syncretism that was constantly criticized by the Bishop of Rhodes. For example, it was not unusual for common people to ascribe sainthood to animals, which they called Pistia Santua, or holy beasts. How these beasts were treated depended on the region, in the south leading to a bizarre tradition of general vegetarianism, while in the north the consumption of their flesh was believed to confer healing miracles, and as such their meat was often dried and distributed to the faithful across Vasconia. Despite barely being Christian, for now, the peace held. The life of the common folk was an interesting one and highly urban. Dozens of cities, great and small, dotted the landscape, and the system of governance was comprised of appointed, non-hereditary governors over these cities and their surrounding lands, serving the crown, providing gold and conscripts for the army. The Vasconian people themselves were highly superstitious and ritualistic, but had a long-running tradition of upward mobility for those who proved themselves to be great warriors. Even the lowest pauper could find himself welcomed into the royal court if he proved himself in battle, and this was what lent to the Vasconians their success in the region. To the south, Emporia, under Sufet Melkart Pies Milkaramid, was the other great contender, and couldn't be more foreign to its neighbors. It was a syncretic empire made up of ethnic Greeks who totally adopted the Punic culture and religion for themselves as they overtook ancient Carthage. It was often said that they wore the skin of a defeated race. Regardless, they thought themselves true Punics regardless, and were a seafaring people, representing one of the dominant forces of trade in the Western Mediterranean. The conquest of Iberia was their ultimate goal, and had been the obsession of the last dozen rulers. The Emporians had an elective system where a legislature made up of two houses, one of officials elected by voting landowners and the other by a chamber of experts appointed for life by the Sufet, these being merchants, philosophers, and community leaders. On the ground, life for your average Emporian was highly urban, and came from the sea. Several huge and crowded cities concentrated nearly the entire population, the rest spread across the otherwise barren coast in tiny fishing villages. In these cities, the teeming mass of people scrambled over each other for money and influence, with all manner of business and debauchery taking place in their winding streets. Ramshackle tables piled high with fabrics and spices and fish and gold, surrounded by a cacophony of bleeding goats and crying slave girls. Life was everything but peaceful for your average Emporian. But, surely, the center of life was the Grand Temple of Baal, a huge structure with a huge seated bull man rearing high over the horizon, hands outstretched and smoke billowing into the sky from an eternal fire. It was into his flames that babes were cast year-round for blessings and good fortune, and poor women of the night were indentured to the service of Baal's temple, crowded beneath his brazen hands as crowds of strange men came and went, casting payment at the feet of the priests. It was said that one could always find the city center by following the wailing sounds of Baal's temple. Emporia was widely hated across Europe, and the Christian realms had them marked for total eradication, having no relations with them outside of war. Then, the Triple Alliance of Neria under King Aponi Maposh Kama III, Topolia under King Smertotama Maposh Olorix III, and Cilicia under King Tectomaros Maposh Aponi V shared much in common. They were all Celts, and largely had a policy of open borders between them as a matter of survival. Their armies worked in tandem, and their aristocracies even intermarried with great frequency. For your average man, he found himself rather burdened by the demands of his lord, working on his land in exchange for food, lodging, and protection, and though he was free to leave and find a better lord should he so desire it, very few made use of this right. As a whole, they teetered on the edge of oblivion, caught between two relative titans who were more focused and singularly determined to achieve victory than they were. Simple survival was enough for these three realms, and indeed many thought it was the best they could hope for. Moving east, the Italian region was a much simpler affair, with Lucania dominating the vast majority of the peninsula, while the upstart maritime power of Sicily stood in stark defiance of Lucanian power. Lucania, under Rex Alfonso Caecilius, was a power that struck a balance between terrestrial and maritime power. Largely self-sufficient for its own sake, able to feed and clothe itself, unlike Emporia, which relied almost entirely on imports, this was the true strength of Lucania. It was a generalist, with large urban centers like Rome and Puglia housing great markets and grand ports, with tall stacks of apartments being home to countless common folk and petty merchants who left their countryside villages to try and strike out on their own. At the same time, the small country villagers which largely governed themselves in a vague sense, who interacted with and were technically subject to the cities and their aristocratic, hereditary governors, produced a lot of the raw materials that the cities depended on. On the ground, Christianity was beginning to take root in the crowded urban centers, but as things stood in the 8th century, it was still by and large a nation of Hellenic pagans. Meanwhile, Sicily, under the serene doge Joachinu Laetorius, was a merchant republic, controlling a vital choke point in the Mediterranean and punching well above its weight in terms of being one of the premier trading powers in the region. On the ground, while prominent merchants were able to elect the Doge for an office of 5-year terms, the common man was largely free of religious laws or cultural diktats, leading to a rather diverse population, consisting of native Sicilians, Greeks, Lucanians, Emporians, Vesconians, and even the odd Scythian. Indeed, on top of all this, Sicily was a prime destination for escaped slaves from Emporia, who often became pirates that harassed Emporian ships. It was said that, by the late 6th century, the famed Maeotian band had relocated, and now primarily operated out of Sicilian ports in exchange for submitting to taxation and an agreement to leave Sicilian vessels alone. As such, many called Sicily a pirate republic as a kind of mocking, derogatory title. To the north, Germania wasn't quite so clear-cut. As the crossroads of Europe, several powers jockeyed for dominance, with Swabia being the strongest contender, dogged on all sides by Travaria, Savacia, Pieria, Guthonia, Anglia, and the Slavic tribes. Beginning with Swabia, under King Nantildo Fratingswaz, it was the lion of the region, being hounded by wolves. Resolutely pagan, their primordial Germanic faith demanded excellence in battle and veneration of their ancestors. Their society was largely typical, with a feudal structure of peasants laboring beneath their lord who labor beneath the king. However, the moderate number of cities throughout Swabia proved an exception to this, with freely elected governors chosen by respected pagan priests. Their manner of warfare was also unique, with the levied armies being called up for times of war, but also permanently standing, totally ungoverned war bands that any who proved their skill could join. Many of these war bands engaged in raiding for which the king claimed no responsibility. The common people of Swabia held several unique traditions in sacred regard, especially the bloodying, which involves young men, as a rite of passage, being covered in the blood of an animal and turned loose in the dense, dark forest for about a week. To their south, Savacia, under King Adiatorix IV Galanid, was populated largely by Central European Gauls, with much in common with the Travarians, including vast battlement structures on their border with a larger neighbor, and submission to the druidic institution of the Sacred Grove, though in Savacia, writing was divided between sacred and mundane script, the mundane script being permitted for common and public use. Savacia also demonstrated a bizarre cultural predilection towards the consumption of lizards and snakes, neither of which were necessarily very common in their alpine climb. This stemmed from a mythic preoccupation with a legendary dragon in their culture that they say birthed their entire ethnic bloodline, named the Belis Dat, or the Beautiful One. The consumption of lizards thus brings them closer to their draconic past. Then, in the far north, the Kingdom of Anglia, under King Sigbert Wicpersunu, was the terror of the waves. With holdings scattered across the North Sea, not only did they control trade, but they also served as the terror of all settled peoples in the region. Anglia, under the blessings of their one-eyed god Wotan, sought blood and conquest as a sacred rite, stringing up their enemies and plucking out an eye to honor their wise deity, and symbolize the sacrifice he made to bring the runes to man. They carried off slaves and sold them to slave markets across Europe, and in some cases even sacrificed them to honor their gods. Anglian society was organized around the warband, which were bands of roving warriors loyal to the king, but otherwise completely autonomous, acting on their own to plunder foreign shores and set up colonies abroad. The king himself controlled his own warband, but instead used that to administer the regions he already held, and enforce law, and also resolve disputes between warbands. Your average commoner was largely left alone, spending the year planting, harvesting, hunting, fishing, or crafting material goods like textiles or processed metals. Ultimately, the warbands drove their conquests across the North Sea, and their independence led to their ultimate success, their lightning-fast surprise attacks that wouldn't be stopped even if one managed to kill the king himself. Commoners who proved themselves in feats of strength before a warband could be allowed to join, but they'd be forbidden from returning home for at least 10 years. The life of the average commoner, meanwhile, was a happy one, with nearly non-existent taxation due to all the foreign plunder and lavish investment by the crown in the countryside itself, building grain stores, apothecaries, and even setting up a courier service that was open to all, the first of its kind. This relatively easy life was punctuated by regular festivals and feasts throughout the year to their various gods, and with their ample free time, they dedicated themselves to some craft or the improvement of their village. Anglia was a nightmare to others, but a dream for their own. A garden of pleasures built upon countless skulls. Then, to the east, Gothonia, under King Hromwald Ingodres, straddled the border between Germania and Eastern Europe. Made up of Goths worshipping under the Germanic faith, they truly did take from both streams of culture, but yet another was on the rise, with the potential to totally reshape the country, and that is the influence of Christianity. Indeed, King Hromwald was himself a Christian, and though many of his subjects hadn't yet adopted it, he aimed to follow in the footfalls of distant Santonia as a blueprint for his rulership. He had long since combined the warbands into one standing army under his rulership, though the aristocracy bristled at his centralization of power and maintained their own forces, which raided without his approval. As such, King Hromwald ended up being a very direct king, ruling over his own vast tracts of land and relying on their taxation, all while he angled to cut down the power of the noble families. In this way, he became a prolific castle builder, building grand fortifications that only the royal house could afford to construct, and serving as a kind of coup insurance. Gothonia thusly became known as the land of castles, and the common people who lived near them feared no raids or war, as their castle walls were always there to take refuge in. Indeed, these castles became the center of village life, with regular festivals and plays being held in their courtyards. It was also these castles that served as centers for Christianization, as the king welcomed foreign monks and priests to stay within their walls and conduct their proselytism from the base of such a strong structure. Of course, all was not well in Gothonia, as apart from playing second fiddle to the power of Swabia, they also had to deal with the constant incursions of the Slavic tribes to the east, with whom they were at constant war. Back west, the Britannic Isles were a battleground in every sense of the word. The Celtic Picts controlled the north, and the Irish Celts of Iblania to the west had taken a foothold in Wales, while the Anglians domineered over countless souls in the plentiful south, establishing what was known at the time as the Anglaw. If Anglia was able to conquer these islands, as the trend seemed to indicate, then they would establish themselves as one of the great powers of the world. But that is only if they are able to. Pictland is the first major obstacle and defender of the islands, under King Maelcon Cait. Pictland was still largely tribal, a complicated web of clans and allegiances and ancient rivalries, each region totally self-governing. Indeed, they only collectively came together and chose a king in the first place to combat the threat of the Anglaw. This was an emergency decision, not a normal state of affairs, and indeed, it showed. The nascent crown had a very rough go of things, with locals unwilling to pay taxes, relinquish men to the king's army, or even to obey the king's peace and stop going to war with other clans. Indeed, the only time it seemed like they could work together was for the yearly Lothian Games, which were a month-long series of athletic challenges and feats of strength, as well as a kingdom-wide matchmaking affair for young couples, presided over by their druids, which were of a separate and distinct independent branch than the mainland's sacred grove. As such, while the Picts were fiercely independent and powerful warriors, they were nonetheless on the back foot, and had been since the Anglians first arrived on the island 10 years earlier. Then, to the west, there were the Iblanians, under King Colbad MacPhailchu, who were locked in perpetual war with the Anglians. The Iblanians were much more centralized, with all members of the aristocratic houses living directly on the king's estate, and appointed governors over tracts of land reporting directly to the crown. Despite this, the crown ruled very, very lightly, and mostly busied itself with the collection of knowledge, and of course, the war against the Angles. Interestingly, they were in talks with the Santonians about Christianity, weighing the option of a potential conversion to bring Santonia in against Anglia. To the east, in northern Europe itself, the story is largely quite similar. The Anglians are the most formidable force in the region, and they are invading north. The other tribal peoples are considering an alliance to resist them, but they haven't been impressed by the Picts, who did something similar. Eastern Europe is only just emerging onto the scene of world history, with countless tribal slaves and Tartars doing battle with each other and raiding into the civilized world, hemmed in by Swabia and Gathania to the west, and Scythia to the south. The Balkans were, in contrast, a major nexus of power, with Pieria and Hellas dominating the region, ancient Macedon attempting to claw their way back to a place of power, and Armistia struggling to survive. Pieria, under King Tritos Verzalid, is perhaps the most aristocratic state in continental Europe in the 8th century. Absolute power is invested in the crown, and all the noble families crowd around it, seeking to please the monarch so as to be blessed with titles and leftover positions of influence. The standing army of the king is his inheritance as a warlord of incomparable brutality, his Illyrian kingdom cold, calculating, and cruel. The people are decently urbanized, but directly administered by a strong crown that levies a heavy tax upon them, both in kind and in conscripted men. In any case, Pieria boasts of one of the most developed middle classes, comprised of educated men in professions such as doctors, blacksmiths, merchants, and fine craftsmen, due in large part to the university system the crown sponsors. This is the only route of social mobility in the country, which for all other intents and purposes might as well operate under a caste system. The Pierian army is feared across the continent, both for being one of the largest and one of the most potently trained. Religiously, they are of the Hellenic pagan tradition, but the church has been making headway among the common people, even at the mercy of some truly brutal persecution. For example, the punishment for Christian faith in the country is to be buried alive, vertical and upside down. Their great rival in the region is Hellas, to the east, under King Saltres Brinkrazarid II. Hellas is of the Thracian culture, and reveres the ancient Dacian god Zelmoxis, the god of war. As such, they are a suitable enemy for Pieria. Hellas places a great emphasis on personal glory in combat, producing soldiers with an extreme mastery of the blade called the Dakina, meaning wolf-hearted. These Dakina are trained from near birth, either orphans or slave children, and raised in the ways of bloodshed, fighting with a long, brutal blade that curves forward called a falx. Many of these children would die in training, but many more would go on to achieve glory on the battlefield. They exist as the shock troops of the army, intended to die a glorious death one day. The rest of the military is comprised of feudal levies volunteered by lesser lords who fear the Pierian army. Hellesian society is built around the veneration of Zelmoxis, and as such, the common people, between planting and harvesting season, often dedicate themselves to athletic games, or works of art, or even musical pursuits in honor of the god. To their south is Macedon, under Basileus Archias Helioclid, who seeks to play the two great northern rivals against each other in a bid to, perhaps, grow in power again, to reclaim that great legacy of Alexander that they once boasted to the world. As things stand, Macedon is largely streamlined beneath the direct authority of the Basileus, but they have implemented an advisory body below his office called the Gerousia, made up of landowning Greek freemen who advise the Basileus on matters of technical expertise, and either approve or deny motions to declare war by the throne. Then, there is fledgling Armistia, an Albanian kingdom under King Durim Beyfrasheri. A pastoral mountain nation, Armistia is only just holding on to survival, unable to project power or properly defend themselves from it. They hope to marry into Pieria as a minor partner, but the Illyrians of the north do not consider them kindly, and neither do the Thracians or the Greeks. Viewed as barbarians on every side, they simply bide their time and pray to the Greek gods that they survive the coming age. Then, to the southeast, Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean are dominated by a few key players who also divvy up the Greek islands. These include Armenia, lord of most of Anatolia, Rhodes, the heart of the Christian world, and Egypt, an ancient and domineering yet declining empire. Armenia, under Emperor Gurgan Orontid II, is in the midst of a golden age. Rich and powerful with a teeming population that is fond of the crown, they survived and repelled the Islamic invasions, and now grapple with a new threat that, if handled poorly, might end their golden age: religion. Armenia has traditionally held to its native gods, but since the Islamic invasions, many Zoroastrian refugees came flooding over the border, and with roads encircling them, an endless stream of missionaries has since agitated the common folk in favor of Christianity. The emperor has a difficult strategic decision to make. Does he keep with his old gods and strike out against Rhodes for strategic territorial gain, which would lead to unrest and possibly civil war, or does he convert to Christianity, gaining a strong ally in the form of Rhodes and placating the bulk of his people, but forever shutting himself out of meaningfully contesting the eastern Mediterranean? That question, for now, will go unanswered, and his people, who are moderately taxed and very involved in cultural pursuits related to statuary, will wait with bated breath as to which god they shall make effigies for. Rhodes, under Basileus Theophilus Demeratid, but truly under Bishop Aristarchus III, is a Christian theocracy and the mechanism of the kingdom of heaven upon earth. The king now serves a purely military role beneath the direction of the Bishop of Rhodes. It is a land dotted by grand cathedrals, and it is said that no matter where you go, you will always see a church spire somewhere in the distance, or hear the great bells ring out some service or feast day. As the center of the burgeoning Christian world, Rhodes is one of the richest and most prosperous countries in the entire world, which shows in their sizable middle class and highest literacy rate in Europe, with church education mandatory for children ages 5 through 10. The Rhodes Navy is also the most elite seaworthy force in the Mediterranean, with ships of war defending the Greek islands they administer, and ships of God destined for far-off lands to bring the gospel to the godless. Their current position is to monitor their win-win situation with Armenia, and angle against the Egyptians in the interests of another war against them, hoping to shut them out of the eastern Mediterranean completely, so as to create a united bulwark against the Muslims of Thamud. Then there was Egypt, under Pharaoh Sopolis Lagat, which was locked in constant conflict with the Muslims to their east. The empire was large and venerable, but that didn't give it any better chances of survival. It was rife with corruption, a long-running Kemetic insurgency of Bastara worshippers, and a rivalry with two major world religions in Christianity and Islam. Their vitality poured out onto Egypt in the form of wrath and conquest. On the ground, the common people languished under a tyrannical nobility, which taxed them heavily and placed the yoke of slavery upon thousands more. Indeed, it seemed as though Egypt's time was past, and as soon as they lost their territory in Greece proper, then the collapse would be nipping at their heels. North Africa, generally, was split between Emporia and Egypt, with a scattered collection of Berber tribes harassing them from the Saharan dunes. Further along, the Middle East was a complicated battleground, with Armenia and Rhodes in the west, the Hellenic Greeks of the Seleucid in the east, and the various Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula jockeying for power, fighting one another for the title of Islamic inheritor. Beginning with the Seleucid Empire under Basileus Hyperides Seleucid, it was the behemoth of the region, but, much like Egypt, its age was truly beginning to show. With a discontented and rivalrous nobility, lack of access to the Mediterranean Sea, rivals in the north like Scythia and Parthia, and rivals in the south like Gerha and Amrame, it seemed as though the Seleucids were about to be torn to shreds from every direction. Like Egypt, it seemed the time of this ancient empire was growing nigh. As covered earlier, the Arabs of the peninsula were warring with each other over Islamic religious doctrine, namely who should rule, with Thamud under Malik Jaha ibn Ismat being Sunni, and Gerha under Wali Malik Mirza Nogani being Shia. Meanwhile, the other scattered Arabs also sought conquest and power, like the Shia Amrame under Malik Zaid Amrame going east against the Selekids, and the Sunni Sabans under Malik Samir Namhadid going west against the tribes of East Africa. Africa, as a whole, beyond the largely conquered north, was undeveloped, teeming with uncontacted tribes and peoples that were only whispered of back across the Great Desert. Finally, Asia saw the wholesale breakdown of the Mauryan Empire, harassed by their fellow Hindus to the south in Pythia, the Muslims of Rayana, the Buddhists of Batavia, the countless Tibetan, and other Central Asian tribes which populated much of the continent. Overall, Samrat Bhaira Ben Ranaryan Maurya of the Maurya Empire and Maharaja Chaunda Pythia of Pythia were at each other's throats, while foreigners like King Wangdu Mu of Zhangzhung made headway south into the subcontinent. And so, that was the world as it lay in 700, and before the year was out, the last of the Upali rebels would be killed in battle, and the last of the Rizvidites would bend the knee, and noble Salamander would crown himself the first Baro Sarvan, meaning High Chief or Emperor of Scythia. All the Scythians lorded over by a single man again. It was finally time to turn his gaze outward, and toward the horizon of conquest that was destined for him and his people.